Chapter 5 Challenges to and Restoration of the Congress System. Challenge of Political Succession. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru passed away in May 1964. He had been unwell for more than a year. This had generated a lot of speculation about the usual question of succession. After Nehru, who? But in a newly independent country like India, this situation gave rise to a more serious question. After Nehru, what? The second question arose from the serious doubts that many outsiders had about whether India's democratic experiment will survive after Nehru. It was feared that, like so many other newly independent countries, India too would not be able to manage a democratic succession. A failure to do so, it was feared, could lead to a political role for the army. Besides, there were doubts if the new leadership would be able to handle the multiple crises and awaited a solution. The 1960s were labeled as a dangerous decade when unresolved problems like poverty, inequality, communal and regional divisions, etc., could lead to the failure of democratic project or even the disintegration of the country. From Nehru to Shastri. The ease with which the succession of after Nehru took place proves the critics wrong. When Nehru passed away, K. Kamraj, the president of the Congress Party, consulted party leaders and Congress members of parliament had found that there was a consensus in favor of Lal Bahadur Shastri. He was unanimously chosen as the leader of the Congress parliamentary party and thus became the country's next prime minister. Shastri was a non-controversial leader from Uttar Pradesh and had been a minister in Nehru's cabinet for many years. Nehru had come to depend a lot on him in his last year. He was known for his simplicity and his commitment to principles. Earlier, he had resigned from the position of railway minister, accepting moral responsibility for a major railway accident. Shastri was the country's prime minister from 1964 to 1966. During Shastri's brief prime ministership, the country faced two major challenges. While India was still recovering from the economic implications of the war with China, failed monsoons, drought, and serious food crisis presented a grave challenge. As discussed in the previous chapter, the country also faced a war with Pakistan, and in 1965, Shastri's famous slogan, Jal Jawan Jai Kisan, symbolized the country's resolve to face both these challenges. Shastri's prime ministership came to an abrupt end on 10 January 1966 when he suddenly expired in Tashkent, then in USSR and currently the capital of Uzbekistan. He was there to discuss and sign an agreement with Muhammad Ayub Khan, the then president of Pakistan, to end the war. Short note on Lal Bahadur Shastri. He was born on 1904 and died on 1966. Prime Minister of India, participated in the freedom movement since 1930. Minister in UP Cabinet, General Secretary of Congress, Minister in Union Cabinet from 1951 to 1956 when he resigned taking responsibility for the railway accident and later from 1957 to 1964. Coined the famous slogan Jai Jawan Jai Kisan. From Shastri to Indira Gandhi. Thus the Congress faced the challenge of political succession for the second time in 2 years. This time there was an intense competition between Morarji Desai and Indira Gandhi. Morarji Desai had earlier served as Chief Minister of Bombay State and also Minister at the centre. Indira Gandhi, the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, had been Congress President in the past and had also been Union Minister for Information in the Shastri cabinet. This time, the senior leaders in the party decided to back Indira Gandhi, but the decision was not unanimous. The contest was resolved through a secret ballot among Congress MPs. Indira Gandhi defeated Morarji Desai by securing the support of more than two-thirds of the party's MPs. A peaceful transition of power, despite intense competition for leadership, was seen as a sign of maturity of India's democracy. It took some time before the new Prime Minister could settle down. While Indira Gandhi had been politically active for very long, she had served as a minister under Lal Bahadur Shastri only for a short period. The senior Congress leaders may have supported Indira Gandhi in the belief that her administrative and political inexperience would compel her to be dependent on them for the support and guidance. Within a year of becoming Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi had to lead the party in a Lok Sabha election. Around this time, the economic situation in the country had further deteriorated, adding to her problems. Faced with these difficulties, she set out to gain control over the party to demonstrate her leadership skills. Indira Gandhi, a short note. Born on 1917, died on 1984. Prime Minister of India from 1966 to 1977 and 1980 to 1984. The daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, participated in the freedom struggle as a young Congress worker, Congress President in 1958, Minister in Shastri's cabinet from 1964 to 66, led the Congress Party to victory in 1967, 1971 and 1980 general elections, credited with the slogan Garibi Hatao, victory in 1971 war, and for policy initiatives like abolition of private purse, nationalization of banks, nuclear tests, and environmental protection. Assassinated on 31st October 1984. Fourth General Elections 1967. The year 1967 is considered a landmark year in India's political and electoral history. In Chapter 2, you read about how the Congress Party was the dominant political force throughout the country from 1952 onwards. This trend was to undergo significant changes with the 1967 elections. Context of the elections. In the years leading up to the four general elections, the country witnessed major changes. Two prime ministers had died in quick succession, and the new prime minister, who was being seen as a political novice, had been in office for less than a year. You will recall from the discussion in Chapter 3 and in previous sections of this chapter that the period was fraught with grave economic crisis resulting from successive failure of monsoons, widespread drought, decline in agricultural production, serious food shortage, depletion of foreign exchange reserves, drop in industrial production and exports, combined with a sharp rise in military expenditure and diversion of resources from planning and economic development. One of the first decisions of the Indira Gandhi government was to devaluate the Indian rupee under what was seen to be pressure from the US. Earlier, $1 would be purchased for less than rupees 5. After devaluation, it cost more than rupees 7. The economic situation triggered off price rise. People started protesting against the increase in prices of essential commodities, food scarcity, growing unemployment, and the overall economic condition in the country. Bans and hartals were called frequently across the country. The government saw the protests as a law and order problem and not as expression of people's problems. This further increased public bitterness and reinforced popular unrest. The Communist and Socialist parties launched struggles for greater equality. You will read in the next chapter about how a group of communists who separated from the Communist Party of India, Marxists, to form the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninists, led armed agrarian struggles and organized peasant agitations. This period also witnessed some of the worst Hindu-Muslim riots since independence. Election in a Rajasthan village. This is a story about 1967 assembly elections in the Chomu constituency. The main parties in the fray were Congress and Swatantra Party. But village Devisar had its own local political dynamics and it got mixed up with the competition between the two parties. Sher Singh traditionally dominated village politics, but gradually his nephew, Bhim Singh, was emerging as the more popular leader and rival. Though both were Rajputs, Bhim Singh cultivated the support of many non-Rajputs in the village by attending to their requirements after becoming the Panchayat Pradhan. so he struck a new unquestioned alliance of Rajputs and non-Rajputs. He proved to be more adept in building alliances across the village by supporting candidates in other villages for the post of village pradhan. In fact, he took an initiative and took a delegation to the state chief minister and Congress leader Mohanlal Sukhadia for pressing the name of one of his friends from a nearby village as Congress candidate in the assembly election. When Sukhadia convinced him of some other name, Bhim Singh in turn convinced many others that they should work for the party candidate. Bhim Singh knew that if the party candidate won from this constituency, the candidate would become a minister and thus he would have direct contacts with a minister for the first time. Sher Singh had no option but to work for the Swatantra candidate who was a Jagirdar. He kept telling people that the Jagirdar would help build the village school and use his resources for the development of the locality. At least in Devisar village, the assembly election had turned into a factional fight between uncle and nephew. Based on Anand Chakravarti, a village in Jammu assembly constituency in Rajasthan. Non-Congressism. This situation could not have remained isolated from party politics in the country. Opposition parties were in the forefront of organizing public protests and pressurizing the government parties opposed to the Congress realized that the division of their votes kept the Congress in power. Thus, parties that were entirely different and disparate in their programs and ideology got together to form anti-Congress fronts in some states and entered into electoral adjustments of sharing seats in others. They felt that the inexperience of Indira Gandhi and the internal factionalism within the Congress provided them an opportunity to topple the Congress. The socialist leader Ram Manohar Lohia gave this strategy the name of non-Congressism. He also produced a theoretical argument in its defense. Congress rule was undemocratic and opposed to the interests of ordinary poor people. Therefore, the coming together of the non-Congress parties was necessary for reclaiming democracy for the people. C. Natarajan Annadurai, born in 1909, died on 1969, Chief Minister of Madras, Tamil Nadu, from 1967, a journalist, popular writer, and orator, initially associated with the Justice Party in Madras province, later joined Dravid Kazhagam and formed DMK as a political party in 1949. A proponent of Dravid culture, he was opposed to the imposition of Hindi and led the anti-Hindi agitation, supporter of greater autonomy of states. Ram Manohar Lohia, socialist leader and thinker, freedom fighter, and among the founders of the Congress Socialist Party. After the split in the parent party, the leader of the Socialist Party and later the Samyukta Socialist Party, member Lok Sabha 1963 to 67, founder editor of Mankind and Jan, known for original contribution to a non-European socialist theory as a political leader, best known for sharp attacks on Nehru, strategy of non-Congressism, advocacy of reservation for backward caste, and opposition of English. Electoral verdict. It was in this context of heightened popular discontent and polarization of political forces that the fourth general election in the Lok Sabha and state assemblies were held in February 1967. The Congress was facing the electorate for the first time without Nehru. The results joined the Congress at both the national and the state levels. Many contemporary political observers describe the election results as a political earthquake. The Congress did manage to get a majority in the Lok Sabha, but its lowest tally of seats and share of votes since 1952. Half the ministers in Indira Gandhi's cabinet were defeated. The political stalwarts who lost in their constituencies included Kamraj in Tamil Nadu, S.K. Patel in Maharashtra, Atulya Ghosh in West Bengal, and K.B. Sahai in Bihar. The dramatic nature of the political change would be more apparent to you at the state level. The Congress lost majority in as many as 7 states. In 2 other states, defections prevented it from forming a government. Those 9 states where the Congress lost power were spread across the country: Punjab, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, West Bengal, Orissa, Madras, and Kerala. In Madras state, now called Tamil Nadu, a regional party, the Dravida Munnetra Kazagham (DMK), came to power by securing a clear majority. The DMK won power after having led a massive anti-Hindi agitation by students against the centre on the issue of transposition of Hindi as the official language. This was the first time any non-Congress party had secured a majority in its own in any state. In the other 8 states, coalition governments consisting of different non-Congress parties were formed. A popular saying was that one could take a train from Delhi to Howrah and not pass through a single Congress-ruled state. It was a strange feeling for those who were used to see Congress in power. Was the domination of the Congress over? Coalitions. The elections of 1967 brought into picture the phenomenon of coalitions. Since no single party had got majority, various non-Congress parties came together to form joint legislative parties called Samyukt Vidyak Dal in Hindi that supported non-Congress governments. That is why these governments came to be described as SVD governments. In most of these cases, the coalition partners were ideologically incongruent. The SVD government in Bihar, for instance, included the 2 socialist parties SSP and PSP, along with the CPI on the left and Jana Sangh on the right. In Punjab, it was called the Popular United Front and comprised the 2 rival Akali parties at that time. Sun Group and Master Group, with both the communist parties, the CPI and the CPIM, the SSP, the Republican Party, and the Bharatiya Jana Sangh. Defection. Another important feature of the politics after the 1967 election was the role played by defections in the making and unmaking of governments in the states. Defection means an elected representative leaves the party on whose symbol he or she was elected and joins another party. After the 1967 general election, the breakaway Congress legislatures played an important role in installing non-Congress governments in 3 states: Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, and Uttar Pradesh. The constant realignments and shifting political loyalties in this period gave rise to expression "Ay Ram, Gaya Ram." The story of Aya Ram, Gaya Ram. The expression Aya Ram, Gaya Ram became popular in the political vocabulary in India to describe the practice of frequent floor crossing by legislatures. Literally translated, the terms meant Ram came and Ram went. The expression originated in an amazing feat of floor crossing achieved by Gaya Lal, an MLA in Haryana, in 1967. He changed his party thrice in a fortnight, from Congress to the United Front, back to the Congress, and then within 9 hours to the United Front again. It is said that when Gaya Lal declared his intention to quit the United Front and join the Congress leader Rao Birendra Singh brought him to Chandigarh press and declared, Gaya Ram was now Aya Ram. Gaya Lal's feat was immortalized in the phrase Aya Ram, Gaya Ram, which became the subject of numerous jokes and cartoons. Later, the constitution was amended to prevent defections. K. Kamaraj was born on 1903 to 1975. Freedom fighter and Congress President, Chief Minister of Madras, having suffered educational deprivation, made efforts to spread education in Madras province, introduced midday meal scheme for school children. In 1963, he proposed that all senior congressmen should resign from office to make way for younger party workers. This proposal is famous as the Kamraj Plan. Split in the Congress. We saw that after the 1967 elections, the Congress remained power at the center, but with a reduced majority and lost power in many states. More importantly, the results proved that the Congress could be defeated at the elections, but there was no substitute as yet. Most Congress coalition governments in the states did not survive for long. They lost majority and either new combinations were formed or president's rule had to be imposed. Indira versus the Syndicate. The real challenge to Indira Gandhi came not from the opposition but from within her own party. She had to deal with the Syndicate, a group of powerful and influential leaders from within the Congress. The Syndicate had played a role in the installation of Indira Gandhi as the Prime Minister by ensuring her election as the leader of the parliamentary party. These leaders expected Gandhi to follow their advice. Gradually, however, Indira Gandhi attempted to assert her position within the government and the party. She chose her trusted group of advisors from outside the party. Slowly and carefully, she sidelined the syndicate. Indira Gandhi thus faced two challenges. She needed to build her independence from the syndicate. She also needed to work towards regaining the ground that the Congress had lost in 1967 elections. Indira Gandhi adopted a very bold strategy. She converted a simple power struggle into an ideological struggle. She launched a series of initiatives to give the government policy a left orientation. She got the Congress Working Committee to adopt a 10-point program in May 1967. This program included social control of banks, nationalization of general insurance, ceiling on urban property and income, public distribution of food grains, land reforms, and provision of house sites to the rural poor. While the syndicate leaders formally approved this left wing program, they had serious reservations about the same. The Congress Syndicate. Syndicate was the informal name given to a group of Congress leaders who were in the control of the party's organization. It was led by K. Kamraj, former Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu and then the President of the Congress Party. It included powerful state leaders like S. K. Patel of Bombay City, S. Nijalingappa of Mysore, N. Sanjeeva Reddy of Andhra Pradesh, and Atulya Ghosh of West Bengal. Both Lal Bahadur Shastri and later Indira Gandhi owed their position to the support received from the syndicate. The group had a decisive say in Indira's first Council of Ministers and also in policy formulation and implementation. After the Congress split, the leaders of the syndicate and those owing allegiance to them stayed with the Congress. Since it was Indira Gandhi's Congress that won the test of popularity, all these big and powerful men of Indian politics lost their power and prestige after 1971. S. Nijalingappa, born in 1902, died on 2000. Senior Congress leader, member of Constituent Assembly, member of Lok Sabha, Chief Minister of the then Mysore state, regarded as the maker of modern Karnataka, President of Congress during 1968 to 71. Karpuri Thakur, born on 1924, died on 1988, Chief Minister of Bihar between December 1970 and June 1971, and again between 1977 and April 1979. Freedom fighter and socialist leader, active in labor and peasant movements, staunch follower of Lohaya, participated in the movement led by JP, known for his decision to introduce reservations for the backward classes in Bihar during his second chief ministership, strong opponent of the use of English language. Presidential elections, 1969. The factional rivalry between the syndicate and the Indira Gandhi became in the open in 1969. Following President Zakir Hussein's death, the post of President of India fell vacant that year. Despite Mrs. Gandhi's reservations, the syndicate managed to nominate her long-time opponent and then the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, N. Sanjeeva Reddy, as the official Congress candidate for the ensuing presidential elections. Indira Gandhi retaliated by encouraging the then Vice President V.V. Giri to file his nomination as an independent candidate. She also announced several big and popular policy measures like the nationalization of 14 leading private banks and the abolition of the privy purse or the special privileges given to former princes. Morarji Desai was the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister. On both of the above issues, serious differences emerged between him and the Prime Minister, resulting in Desai leaving the government. Congress had seen differences of this kind in the past, but this time both the parties wanted a showdown which took place during the presidential elections. The then Congress President S. Nijalingappa issued a whip asking all the Congress MPs and MLAs to vote in the favor of Sanjeeva Reddy, the official candidate of the party. Supporters of Indira Gandhi requisitioned a special meeting of the AICC. That is why this faction came to be known as requisitionist. But this was refused. After silently supporting V.V. Giri, the Prime Minister openly called for conscience vote, which meant that the MPs and the MLAs from the Congress should be free to vote the way they want. The election ultimately resulted in the victory of V.V. Giri, the independent candidate, and the defeat of Sanjeeva Reddy, the official Congress candidate. The defeat of the official Congress candidate formalized the split in the party. The Congress president expelled the Prime Minister from the party. She claimed that her group was the real Congress. By November 1969, the Congress group led by the Syndicate came to be referred as the Congress, and the group led by Indira Gandhi came to be called the Congress. These two parties were also described as Old Congress and New Congress. Indira Gandhi projected the split as an ideological divide between socialists and conservatives, between the pro-poor and the pro-rich. V.V. Giri, 1894 to 1980. President of India from 1969 to 1974. Congress worker and Labour leader from Andhra Pradesh, Indian High Commissioner to Ceylon, Sri Lanka, Labour Minister in Union Cabinet, Governor of UP, Kerala, Mysore, Vice President and Acting President after the death of President Zakir Hussain, resigned and contested presidential election and independent candidate, received support from Indira Gandhi for his election as president. Abolition of the privy purse. In Chapter 1, you have read about the integration of the princely states. This integration was preceded by an assurance that after the dissolution of princely rule, the then rulers' families would be allowed to retain certain private property and given a grant in heredity or government allowance measured on the basis of the extent, revenue, and potential of the merging state. This grant was called the privy purse. At the time of accession, there was little criticism of these privileges since integration and consolidation was the primary aim. Yet, hereditary privileges were not consonant with the principles of equality and social and economic justice laid down in the Constitution of India. Nehru had expressed his dissatisfaction over the matter and again. Following the 1967, Indira Gandhi supported the demand that the government should abolish privy purse. Morarji Desai, however, called the move morally wrong and amounting to a breach of faith with the prince. The government tried to bring a constitutional amendment in 1970, but it was not passed in the Rajya Sabha. It was then issued an ordinance which was struck down by the Supreme Court. Indira Gandhi made this into a major election issue in 1971 and got a lot of public support. Following its massive victory in 1971 election, the constitution was amended to remove legal obstacles for abolition of privy purse. The 1971 election and restoration of Congress. Split in the Congress reduced Indira Gandhi government to a minority, yet her government continued in office with the issue-based support of a few other parties, including the Communist Party of India and the DMK. During this period, the government made conscious attempts to project its socialist credentials. This was also a phase when Indira Gandhi vigorously campaigned for implementing the existing land reforms laws and undertook further land ceiling legislation. In order to end her dependence on other political parties, strengthen her party's position to the parliament, and seek a popular mandate for her programs, Indira Gandhi's government recommended the dissolution of the Lok Sabha in December 1970. This was another surprising and bold move. The fifth general election to Lok Sabha were held in February 1971. The contest, the electoral contest appeared to be loaded against Congress R. After all, the new Congress was just one faction of an already weak party. Everyone believed that the real organizational strength of the Congress Party was under the command of the Congress. To make matters worse for Indira Gandhi, all the major non-communist, non-Congress opposition parties formed an electoral alliance known as the Grand Alliance. The SSP, PSP, Bharatiya Janasangh, Swatantra Party and Bharatiya Kranti Dal came together under this umbrella. The ruling party had an alliance with the CPI. Yet the new Congress had something that its big opponents lacked. It had an issue, an agenda, and a positive slogan. The Grand Alliance did not have a coherent political program. Indira Gandhi said that the opposition alliance had only one common program: Indira Hatao, remove Indira. In contrast to this, she put forward a positive program captured in the famous slogan, Garibi Hatao, remove poverty. She focused on the growth of the public sector, imposition of ceiling on rural land holdings and urban property, removal of disparities in income and opportunity, and abolition of princely privileges. Through Garibi Hatao, Indira Gandhi tried to generate a support base among the disadvantaged, especially among the landless laborers, Dalits and Adivasis, minorities, women, and unemployed youth. The slogan of Garibi Hatao and the programs that followed it were part of Indira Gandhi's political strategy of building an independent nationwide political support base. The outcome and after. The results of the Lok Sabha elections in 1971 were as dramatic and as was the decision to hold these elections. The Congress alliance won more seats and votes than the Congress had ever won in the first four general elections. The combined won 375 seats in Lok Sabha and secured 48.4% votes. Indira Gandhi's Congress won 352 seats with about 44% of the popular votes on its own. Contrast this with the performance of the Congress. The party with so many stalwarts could get less than one-fourth of the votes secured by the Indira Gandhi's party and win merely 16 seats. With this, the Congress party led by Indira Gandhi established its claim on being the real Congress and restored to it the dominant position in the Indian politics. The grand alliance of the opposition proved a grand failure. The combined tally of seats was less than 40. Soon after the 1971 Lok Sabha elections, a major political and military crisis broke out in East Pakistan. As you have read in Chapter 4, the 1971 elections were followed by the crisis in East Pakistan and the Indo-Pak War leading to the establishment of Bangladesh. These events added to the popularity of Indira Gandhi. Even the opposition leaders admired her statesmanship. Her party swept through all the state assembly elections held in 1972. She was seen not only as the protector of the poor and the underprivileged, but also a strong nationalist leader. The opposition to her, either within the party or outside of it, simply did not matter. With two successive election victories, one at the center and other at the state level, the dominance of the Congress was restored. The Congress was now in power in almost all the states and was popular across different social sections. Within a span of 4 years, Indira Gandhi had warded off the challenge of her leadership and to the dominant position of the Congress party. Restoration? But does it mean that the Congress system was restored? What Indira Gandhi had done was not a revival of the old Congress party. In many ways, she had reinvented the party. The party occupied a similar position in terms of its popularity as in the past, but it was a different kind of party. It relied entirely on the popularity of the supreme leader. It had a somewhat weak organizational structure. This Congress party now did not have many factions. Thus, thus it could not accommodate all kinds of opinions and interests. While it won elections, it depended more on some social groups, the poor, the women, Dalits, Adivasis, and the minorities. This was a new Congress that had emerged. Thus, Indira Gandhi restored the Congress system by changing the nature of the Congress system itself. Despite being more popular, the new Congress did not have the kind of capacity to absorb all tensions and conflicts that the Congress system was known for. While the Congress consolidated its position and Indira Gandhi assumed a position of unprecedented political authority, the spaces for democratic expression of people's aspirations actually shrank. The popular unrest and mobilization around issues of development and economic deprivation continued to grow. In the next chapter, you will read about how this led to a political crisis that threatened the very existence of constitutional democracy in the country. Zanjeer. Vijay, a young police officer, is framed in false charges and sent to jail while fighting gangsters. Released from jail, Vijay is determined to take revenge. He fights all odds and vanquishes the villains. Even while he is engaged in taking revenge, Vijay is fighting the antisocial element and gets the tacit support of many others from within the system. This film portrayed the erosion of moral values and the deep frustrations arising from that quite forcefully. It represents the indifference of the system and the harsh volcanic eruption of protest through the anger of Vijay. This film set the trend of what was later to be known as the angry young man of the 70s. Year 1973, director Prakash Mehra, screenplay Javed Akhtar, cast Amitabh Bachchan, Ajit, Jaya Bhaduri, Pran.